moment and offer some actionable insights and inspirations that you can use today in your lives as educators, parents, and leaders. We hope that what we surface in these conversations provides hope and can add fuel to the push for equity, and create circumstances for transformation across education. My name is Barry Walsh, and I'm the Director of Editorial Strategy at the Harvard Ed School and one of the producers of Education Now. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation about new approaches to screen time sanity, which is something that I know we can all use, and we need to do a whole other episode on how adults can achieve screen time sanity. But first, I want to let you know that today's episode is being recorded and will be available to view on the Harvard Ed School's YouTube channel and Facebook page. You can also visit hgse.me/ednow for recordings and for information about our future episodes. Today, you can put your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and there's closed captioned access there as well. So we look forward to hearing from you. And now let me welcome our great panel of guests. We have Mimi Ito, who is the director of the Connected Learning Lab and professor in residence and MacArthur Foundation Chair in Digital Media and Learning at the University of California, Irvine. She's also the co-founder of Connected Camps, which I hope we can talk a bit about later. We also have Merve Lapus, who's the Vice President of Outreach and National Partnerships at Common Sense Education, which is a resource that I turn to frequently. In that role, Merve works with school, community, and state leaders to foster new approaches to digital well-being across all settings. And then we have Sonia Livingstone, who's a professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Sonia's latest book is Parenting for a Digital Future, which is about as apt as we can get these days. So welcome, everybody. I want to get us started right away by starting with a question for all of you, but starting with Sonia. In your new book about parenting for this digital future that we face, you talk about the deep discomfort that many of us feel about the digital technology that sort of surrounds us and our kids these days. And but I thought you have a great phrase in there where you referred to today's kids as digital by default. And so given that, I wonder if the three of you, but starting with you, Sonia, could just talk from your different lenses and kind of set a baseline for us. Describe, if you could, what you think of as the most common concerns or dilemmas that caregivers and educators are facing as they try to sort of navigate this digital landscape that we're in. So Sonia, if you could start, that would be great.
Sure. So the way I think of the problem for parents, but also for educators, is that children are children today, and they'll be adults in 20 years. And no one can imagine what the world will be in 20 years. But in our book, we asked parents how they thought about it. And they always thought about some kind of science fiction dystopian world in which the machines have taken over. And it's really hard to imagine, if you can't imagine the future, how do you prepare children for it? And that's what parents and educators are really committed to doing. So we kind of think about kids as digital by default, especially during COVID, because a lot of the advice for parents really kind of focuses on like the digital is somehow optional and they could take it or leave it, or they can limit it and they can do something else. And we're really trying to kind of figure out ways of advising, from my point of view, parents, but I think also children and educators, how to think about what digital media can do and where they should be. We should take different directions or redesign them in different ways so that, our digital default lives are beneficial for everybody, and especially kids.
Great, thanks. Mimi, maybe you could share next.
Yeah, just to build on what Sonia was saying, it's a very interesting time for somebody like me who's been sort of advocating for socially connected and social emotional learning online, which is something that before COVID, a lot of parents and educators didn't think online and those words went together very well. And I think we're at a moment where we're really seeing, tremendous need in terms of, well, academic learning, but also growing recognition that we really need to have a base of well-being and social connection for young people to be able to be academically successful. And then the question arises, well, how can our digital connection support that, given that there's limitations for in-person? So like Sonia said, we can't just say, oh, send the kids to the park and the playground, and that's where they'll find, real connections. And I've been studying Minecraft communities and fan fiction communities and places, social media engagement. These are all places where young people have actually turned to for social and emotional connection for a very long time, but adults have had a very difficult time recognizing those kinds of digital connections as sources, especially gaming, for social support until COVID. And suddenly there's sort of this recognition that, oh, kids hanging out and playing Minecraft together or sharing, memes are actually a source of social and emotional support that is important, valuable, and today during COVID, actually essential. So I think that's sort of the set of concerns that have always been there, and young people have felt misunderstood and that their lives aren't taken serious, their digital lives aren't taken seriously. And, we do have an opportunity to revisit that conversation in a different way. I think the big concern I have is that, that availability for that kind of support is very inequitably distributed. And I think there's been a lot of attention, not always successful, to continuity of academic instruction, but not continuity in terms of the more enriched social, playful forms of connection that schools, after school programs, summer camps, playgrounds have provided for young people.
I'm just gonna jump in there, and I love what you both have all shared, and it's exactly right on point. I mean, I think one thing, just as Mimi was saying, these things all existed even before COVID. Like, the pandemic exacerbated the realities that parents are now kind of better understanding. Kids are going to developmentally be, especially teens and young tweens, developmentally they want to be where their friends are at and are going to do what they can to socialize and be with their friends. Even before the pandemic, parents were already limiting the amount of time kids can spend outside without them, independently with their friends. And developmentally, so kids are going to want to be where they're at, and where they're at are these online platforms, which are now, for them, we might call them as utilities or tools, but for kids, these are real spaces for them, right? So we're seeing that more and more. Now we're starting to see a little bit more of that value, because we can't have them outside. We're seeing the value in some of these digital spaces. And as you think about the education side, which is where I spend a lot of my work, educators are also being pulled to have to understand the pedagogical shift of how we help kids learn. Because learning in a classroom has a very different way in which you can provide content, assess, share, and really get kids to learn, different academic content areas that they're looking at. But now we've got limited time for school, because you just can't, in most cases at least, they're not Zooming from 8 to 3 or 4. In some cases they are. That's a whole burnout issue there. But delivering, academic studies on a Zoom or any other kind of platform is just a different pedagogical learning frame. And so having educators, especially thinking forward, as we look at blended classrooms, potentially blended learning classrooms, potentially, or having to react to an issue now switching to fully online, that's exhausting. It takes a lot of training and support. And I think, we are all trying to kind of get through this together. I think we're really starting to see some of the areas that need to be further developed in terms of development and support for teachers, but as well as for parents to better understand how they can be, part of the learning for their kids, and how do we find more diverse learning experiences for kids, being that we're not going to be able to necessarily get the same rigorous core experience unless you've been doing homeschool your whole life, which in that case has been built that way. But for those kids transitioning from an in-person school to an at-home school, these worlds are colliding, and we're still really, seeing the challenges that are coming from it, and doing our best to kind of learn from them.
Yeah, gosh, I thank you guys so much for that introduction, which really touched on so many of the issues, and I think propels us forward. So in my notes, I had this question for you that said, if you could wave a magic wand and sort of dilute some fears of parents to help them navigate, what would it be? And I'm going to ask you to hold that sort of piece of advice or magic wand until the end of the conversation, because I think I want to pick up on some things that you just raised. I mean, specifically as a parent who's now home with a child, and speaking for many parents who are, I think we're all getting kind of a close-up look at a lot of different things that certainly for me as the parent of an 8th grader, I may not, an 8th grade boy, you know, I'm looking at, is he engaged? Is he being polite? Is he smiling at his classmates? Is he in a good mood or bad mood after the class? All sorts of things that I normally would not have had a lens on if you were in a school building. But the biggest thing that is on my mind is sort of the nature of the screen time. You know, both the amount of time that he's spending on devices, in whether it's learning or recreational, but also just sort of this, it sort of busts these norms that I think we all had, where it was like screen time is either good or bad. And that duality or something, if that's the right way to put it, I feel like is just not helpful at all in this world, as the three of you sort of alluded to. So maybe Sonia, I think I'm looking to you to see, could you help us with maybe some new norms around screen time or new ways of thinking about the role of digital technology in our lives that might be more helpful than this sort of old, like, screen time, good, bad type of thing?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that made me, no one could possibly welcome COVID, but it is interesting that one of the kind of unexpected side effects is that I think screen time has to be a finished concept. Screen time is dead but you know, a lot of people were saying in recent years, screen time is just not helpful. And what we saw in our field work with parents was that screen time had itself become the problem, like trying to watch the clock and worrying about policing their child instead of, you know, kind of talking to their child or engaging. Parents were kind of watching the clock and feeling judged by each other, feeling judged by the kind of the advice they get, which was all about quantity of time. And there's a whole host of reasons we don't have time to kind of elaborate about why that concept doesn't work. But for parents, it was like, you know, it was like kind of King Canute trying to hold back the sea in a kind of a digital free time, which doesn't make any sense. So in the book, you know, we talk a lot about why parents variously kind of want to embrace digital technologies in some ways, resist in other, and they're trying to achieve a balance. And for me, that sense of the balance is actually very just as you said, which is not how much time and is it too much or too little, but is my child happy? Are they getting on with their friends? Are they, you know, enjoying their schoolwork? Are they sleeping well? Are they courteous in the family? You know, think about the outcomes we want for our kids and then work backwards. What does it take? Maybe some kind of engagement with screens helps family harmony because people can share it together. And sometimes it's too much and the parent's role is to provide alternatives. So I think start with what you're trying to achieve with your child and what you want for them and what they want, because screen time is a discourse imposed by adults on kids. No kids talk about it. When kids talk to me about screen time, I really know they've heard too much from the media themselves, you know, because that's not their spontaneous discourse. And then, you know, where all of this is going to take us is we have to think about the kind of engagement, the kind of learning, the quality of the experience, the nature of the content that young people are engaging with. You know, that's where we need to shift the discourse to the content, the context of engagement, what connections it offers.
Yeah, great. And thank you, because that was all completely directly relevant to me, at least. So thank you for that. And maybe Mimi, you could pick up on what Sonia just said about kind of the nature of the learning. I mean, you, I think, you know, have already alluded, but think a lot about this. And I'm just wondering from you how digital learning can be rich and meaningful, how this sort of connected learning that you work on might be a useful concept for educators and families to think about today.
Yeah, so, you know, when we talk about connected learning, we're really talking about the learning that young people are doing when they're engaged in something that they have a genuine interest in or they think is relevant to their lives. And they're doing it in a social context where they're working with caring adults and peers with a shared interest. And so a lot of what I look at in terms of the digital spaces, I mean, connected learning doesn't have to be digital, are things like Minecraft servers are, in mixed age groups. Our, nonprofit Connected Camps has a near peer mentorship model where we train high school and college kids to work with slightly younger kids and just geek out together on like game design or creating YouTube videos and building a Minecraft community. So those are the contexts that, if you look at what are the genuine strengths of digital, as opposed to thinking of digital as a second-rate version of what happens within the four walls of a schoolroom, it's the fact that they can stay connected in a lightweight way, in parallel with other activities, that the connections aren't so brittle, which is what we found when schools shut down, that suddenly educators couldn't reach their kids. They don't have because there weren't existing digital connections that were persistent and resilient to homes and directly with kids. A lot of schools lost their connections to families, especially low-income families, during the pandemic because they didn't have a Discord server where they were hanging out with their kids, because they didn't have after-school programs that were digitally connected. And a lot of the programs that we work with in community-based organizations who had the mobile phone numbers of their kids or who were doing gaming environments, they were able to stay connected with their kids. And so I think that there's a real opportunity here, both because there's a need for those social connections to tap young people and their online affinity networks and their digital interests. Like Roblox has exploded during the pandemic. Kids are going back to Minecraft. Even kids who aren't gaming are playing things like Scribble and Among Us, as watching Twitch. And these are all things like, when we shut down, the very first thing we did was we expanded the hours of our free Minecraft server, which is open to everybody, just so kids have a place to hang out. And then for the programs we're working with, we spun up Discord servers so that kids could stay connected. And it wasn't all just like staring at a Zoom screen, like doing academic content. It's like side by side. We play games, we watch movies together, we share memes, we chat. What are you doing for your kids that used to happen in the cafeteria or after school or in the playground? Where are kids finding those spaces of connection and healing where they're mingling with other kids, skateboarding together, whatever it is that they're doing? Those are the spaces that kids are really, really craving now. And digital is a real opportunity to do that in a way that is equitable and could be, very lightweight and widely shared. The problem is that because public schooling has so often been conceptualized as something within a brick and mortar context, as something that is genuinely connected to the home context, a lot of schools didn't have the ability to provide those supports. So I think that's where some creative thinking, the platform where we offer our courses, our Connected Camps courses, it's called OutSchool, primarily was for homeschooling. They grew 2,000% during COVID. But this is a model that is for families that can pay for it, we offer programs to schools as well, but very few schools have been able to take advantage of our programs because that infrastructure isn't there. So I think in that sense, COVID has opened up sort of a real needs gap in terms of this kind of more social, near peer and connected form of learning.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it'll be great, Merve, to hear you talk a minute about that crossover that we need to see between what happens in the home and what schools are able to maybe pick up on. I know that in our house, we set up a daily Zoom call for his friends to play Minecraft with him. And I realized that it was a social outlet. I didn't know that. And I had to overcome all of my own, like, my gosh, you're still on there, but I realized they're actually very engaged and solving problems and all of that stuff. So Merve, I know you work a lot about kind of community approaches to digital being, which I think is such a cool concept, and it feels like very relevant to what we're saying now. Can you tell me about what that digital well-being kind of can mean to you today, or mean to us today?
Sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is important to recognize that, talking about these types of issues should be a whole community approach. The reality is technology is far more ubiquitous now than it's ever been. And the cost for technology is is relatively cheaper now. Access to high speed and maybe like actual traditional like laptops or highly effective laptops, those, yes, can be challenging to get into every household. But because it is so ubiquitous, the conversations around how we use it and the ways that it's bringing value into our lives, or even the challenges, those conversations should be just as ubiquitous, which is one of the things that I focus on in schools, from digital citizenship to understanding that, balance is really not all screen time's created equal. So what is passive engagement versus active engagement? And what are you getting out of it? Much like, Sonia was mentioning, what is the goal of what you're doing here? Some of it is about having active collaborative experiences with your friends and community. Others are just about, watching strategy. I mean, maybe you mentioned earlier, Twitch and other platforms where kids are just watching other kids play, and parents tell me, I don't understand why they watch other people playing video games. And I respond back, I don't understand why you watch so much Property Brothers and other home improvement stuff that have done nothing to your home. It's kind of the same idea. Like, they're just seeing what others are doing, and that's their world. Part of it, though, is also getting you to understand where you're at as a parent. It's so funny because I work from home right now, outside of being in my car right now. This is my quiet space outside of the home. But my kids have their own Zoom calls for school. My wife has her own work calls as well, and so it gets really busy in there, right? And so it's being able to understand that, one, when I'm off, and now I'm focused on you. So as a parent, you got to realize this has allowed me to really connect and do all my work, and so I'm so important. I got to be in this meeting. Please don't bother me. When do you stop that and say, okay, now I'm all about you? And all about you might mean playing a game with you, or getting a sense of what you're doing and learning about what you took out of that last kind of game that you played on Roblox, whatever it might be. But we have to take that time as a parent to oftentimes stop, pause, recognize, this is my time to connect with you. What did you learn? How did you learn it? Was it effective? How do I communicate with my educator, as a partner, to say, oh yeah, my daughter totally understood it. Here are some of the areas where we have challenges. We need to be better with recognizing that we're all learning as we go, checking ourselves, because oftentimes parents can be called out for their hypocrisy. Teens like to do it all the time and be like, you put rules on me, but I see you on your Facebook all the time. Just because it's Instagram or TikTok doesn't make it any different, right? So we really have to think about these things as a community. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to me as a parent? What does it mean as a community organizer or stakeholder in terms of how I'm using it and how it's affecting or supporting you as a child or a student who's curating your own voice and experience.
That's awesome. I love that. I think the dialogue with educators, between parents and educators, is interesting. And we have a question in the chat that I think is just really interesting to consider, which is just, should sort of digital learning strategies or issues around digital access be part of teacher training? Should these be budget items in professional development settings? Because teachers, as we've just identified, as Mimi mentioned, I mean, when we were confronted with this crisis, many of us did not have any experience to draw from, and had not been trained or didn't know what effective teaching and learning strategies were. What is your thinking about how we can better support educators in gaining this sort of fluency that might be helpful as we go forward? And maybe Merve, you can start.
Sure. I mean, this was actually my magic wand moment that you were going to ask earlier. It's like, oh man, more teacher training, and more access, because the reality, there's a lot of great content out there. Like, Common Sense actually opened up a whole nother learning portal called Wide Open School that's meant to be pulling in all these great learning activities, from online field trips to other ways of diving into things like movement and social emotional learning, and things that parents need to consider for diversifying their learning experiences at home, all the way to just recognizing, that educators are doing their best, but have only been given the training they've been given. And like Mimi mentioned earlier, that training hasn't necessarily been online learning or distance learning. So we've actually been doing, we do distance learning chats with educators every Friday. And we've currently to date have trained over 26,000 educators since March on how to use technology in more effective and efficient ways, and then really addressing the big challenges around distance learning. And so we're trying to find ways to do that also in ways that they can consume it, because reality is these educators are also parents themselves, having their own kids going through a distance learning class as they're trying to lead their own. So where do you find those asynchronous opportunities for training? Where do you find access to free training? Oftentimes training can be expensive. So what are districts providing, resources to? And training is much more than just how do you start a Zoom call or a Microsoft Teams call. It's got to be into understanding the pedagogical connection and assessment. One of the things that Mimi mentioned earlier is like, as well as Sonia's, what are we trying to measure? What are our outcomes? And it can't just be our A to Gs or what we know they would be assessed on later with any kind of state standard test. What are the real learning outcomes that we can spend our time on? And especially being a distance learning experience can allow for that independent learning to blend in with that more synchronous learning. And how do they actually tie together? And then how do you measure, right? Because these are all new ways that are similar, but different.
Yeah. Yeah. So much to say on that. I want to ask Sonia, do you worry? And I'm assuming if we get to that place where what are we trying to measure and the outcomes, the experiences that people are having in digital learning are rich, then maybe we don't worry as much about health consequences. But is that something, Sonia, that you hear in your research, the concerns from parents about health effects, posture, eyesight, those sorts of physical things, but also just emotional well-being? Do you have any thoughts or worries on that front and how to navigate those worries?
I think parents worry about absolutely everything about their kids, and they worry about all of those things. And during COVID, they worry about them even more because their options are so incredibly limited. What we know as researchers, or what we knew before everyone was so completely digital by default, is that when kids have health problems or weight problems or fitness, the digital media use is a small part of that story, but also important to all the other things that really matter to parents, like can they access healthy food? Do they have access to kind of physical, green space outside the home? What does the traffic mean that they can't? So, there's a lot of things that play into kids' health, of which screen time, digital media, sure, is one. But if I think, what can we say to parents about all of those worries? I would really love them to kind of step back from the worries we keep telling them about, because when I really began listening to parents, they have other concerns, and those concerns come from the structural and like biographical things they're dealing with. They might be dealing with migration, they might be dealing with their kids' special educational needs, they might be dealing with, kind of cultural tensions or family tensions. There's a lot of things they need to focus on, and we keep giving them this agenda of this affects everybody. Yeah. But actually they've got plenty to worry about already, and what they need are solutions, and what they need are kind of directions and suggestions that build on their strengths, that don't keep positioning them as the ignorant ones, the ones who are getting it all wrong, but kind of building on the parents' interest, because they're learning about digital media and technology through their work, through their interests. We need to draw that out of them. And one of the kind of saddest things in a way that we saw it, or one of the things we saw in our field work, that was parents often pursuing their own kind of interest-driven learning, if you like, but when it came to their kid, feeling they couldn't harness that, they couldn't draw on that, because that would be screen time and that would be judged ill by others. So, I think we kind of need to back off and empower parents a bit more. We talk about empowering kids, but not so much parents.
That's a great point. I am going to ask you guys to consider your magic wand / one piece of advice, and Merve, you may have to come up with another one now.
I'll have one.
I'm gonna ask one last question to Mimi. I know we're coming up on time here, but Mimi, we have a question in the chat about supporting engagement on screens for particularly for younger students, but there are educators who are liking what you're saying about sort of leaning into technology and trying to, and those learning experiences that can come from the connected learning that you're describing. But teachers wondering how to tap into that. They have a hard time teaching when they can't see their students fully and see the cues that they may be giving them. And then they want to know how they can help support social interactions. Sometimes kids have their cameras off, and we need to respect kids' needs around that. So any thoughts on your end about how an educator working over Zoom today can engage with kids, with students?
Yeah, so I think, I really feel for educators who have honed their craft in the classroom and in face-to-face context for so many years and having to make this really abrupt transition. A lot of what we advocate for in online learning, it doesn't look at all like, staring at people's faces and trying to make eye contact in Zoom, like you would in the real life classroom. And I think if you're trying to replicate, that experience of being able to circulate among kids and really look them in the eye and do all these things that educators, have developed such a rich tool set around online, it's going to be really, really frustrating. And I think my advice, which is take it with a grain of salt because I am not that classroom educator, but what we do in our programs that have been online from the very start is what can we do to leverage the strengths of online rather than try to replicate the in-person experience, and to sort of relieve some of that tension and anxiety that you're not doing things the way, to the level and quality that you're used to doing in the classroom. It's not going to happen. You can't expect little kids to be staring at squares on a Zoom screen and have that same kind of connection. But what you can do online is you can share memes. You can laugh at TikTok videos and put emoji in chats and like have people rapidly respond. You can use chat so people can be talking over each other in ways that in a classroom, it would be incredibly disruptive, right? So if you're using Discord, or even if you're just using the chat function on Zoom, like suddenly you can have like a chorus of voices like shouting over each other. And there are things that you can do in digital that you can't do in real life. And so I think it's sort of just relieving, educators of the burden of having to replicate the experience and saying there's a lot of really fun things that happen when, you're engaging in chat or being able to go off on threads in ways that are different when, you're in an acoustically, shared space. I'll share just, I've talked to students too who say that like it was really hard for them to focus on a lecture in a physical lecture hall, but because they're home and they can have a quiet space and control their environment, they're much better able to process that information. So again, there are examples of where the digital is better that I think is better to focus on than what you're doing less well in the digital environment.
Yes, thank you. And I think that, a common thread that is in this conversation and it is in a lot of our education now is let's give each other a break. So that's kind of my magic wand, I guess. But I want to end by asking each of you, and I know you've each shared nuggets of advice, but is there one takeaway that you might want to leave people with today? And I'll ask you, Sonia, first, if you don't mind. If you could alleviate a concern or provide a piece of advice, what would that be?
Listen to kids. I think every time parents, educators, everyone, we're always describing what kids are getting out of media to them and for them, and they take it on, which is depressing. But listen to them. They're always surprising. They're always witty. They're always creative. They have a different interpretation, and then try and act on what they say.
Great. Merve, what about you? I know you've given us one already.
Yeah, I mean, I think this actually is kind of in the spirit of what Mimi was mentioning earlier, is that equitable reach for all students. I mean, every student has a voice and an experience. In many cases, the students that don't have the access oftentimes are going through struggles that, if given the access, could blow your mind, right? And vice versa, for those that have been in it, to see a perspective from someone else who can then help create the next generation of new products or resources or opportunities. Like, it's just an amazing thing to see kids who have less of a box that they're working around be given the power and the framework to do so in a way where they feel confident in the space that they're in, so that they can innovate and support each other. And providing more of that and more of that opportunity, I think is the future of kid success. So I really, that'd be another magic wand. If I were to get into Hogwarts and choose two, that would be the second.
That's a phenomenal and so important one. Thank you. Gosh, Mimi, do you have one last one? I know you already kind of dropped yours, but anything else we should keep in mind?
Well, I'll just second a lot of what has already been said, is to just spend less time worrying about meeting all the metrics that we had pre-COVID. A lot of the screen time stuff, the worries about addiction, gaming, social media, they're largely manufactured by the media. So just remember that. Look at Candace Auger's research that has analyzed in depth some of those dynamics. There was a recent study from the Institute for Family Studies of during COVID that screen time around games and social media has actually declined for this generation. So just keep in perspective that none of that is evidence driven across a population. Of course, there's individuals that have differences in how they engage. And then, so there's so much worry about screen time, about falling behind academically, all of these things. So just take a deep breath, worry less about that, and suspend judgment, like Sonia said, about what kids are doing online, and take some time to listen and use it as a point of connection. If you can stop that worrying mind to suspend judgment about what your kids are doing online, it actually becomes a point of connection. In fact, that same study showed that teens are actually experiencing largely doing fine under COVID. Again, large differences based on equity issues. Their mental health has actually been pretty good. And a lot of them have described how it's been a really precious moment to rekindle connections to family. So by worrying too much, you can miss the opportunity to take this as a moment to really connect to your children and teens. When else do we have the opportunity to really have insight into their daily lives, their academic struggles? Same with teachers, our counselors on Connected Camps. We get so many messages from parents just saying, thank you so much for giving them this meaningful relationship at a time when this is healing, it's valued. We recognize the essential nature of these connections. There's an intensity to this moment that gives us an opportunity to create connections and relationships that may be digital, but they're no less important. And I think taking that moment to invest in those relationships is really what I would encourage everybody to do.
Yeah, well, that's a great final point. I want to thank all the educators out there who are striving to build those connections and to build those equitable connections, to unleash the power of those connections for their students. I know we're all navigating incredibly uncertain territory these days. So I thank the educators out there for joining us today. Thank the parents out there for joining us today. And I thank you three for joining us today. This has just been completely enlightening for me. And as a parent, certainly, and as just a kind of person in the world today, trying to deal with what we're all trying to deal with. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Please stay in touch with us, and please also feel free to check in on this episode and our future episodes at hgse.me/ednow. We've got more coming later in the fall. But in the meantime, thanks you all again, and take care and stay well, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.